For 700 years, stretching from a world before Christianity existed to an age when Islam was only beginning to rise, two superpowers glared at each other across scorching deserts, frozen mountain ranges, and cities that changed hands so often that their people stopped bothering to repaint the walls. It was a conflict so ancient and so relentless that a Roman soldier fighting Persians in the last century before Christ would have believed the war was as old as time itself. And a Byzantine soldier fighting Persians 600 years later would have thought the exact same thing. Imagine a war so vast that it began when Rome was still a pagan republic with no emperors and ended when Byzantine emperors were defending Christianity as a state religion. A war so enduring that it started before the birth of Jesus and ended just as the armies of Islam were erupting from Arabia, bringing an entirely new power into a world exhausted by centuries of East-West struggle. History. This was the titanic, 700-year collision between the Roman world and the Persian world, the longest continuous geopolitical rivalry ever recorded. An ancient Cold War that erupted again and again into scorching infernos of blood, ambition, revenge, and destiny. It all began not with grand declarations or centuries of animosity, but almost by accident. Rome, riding high after defeating Carthage and absorbing Greece, expanded eastward until it ran headlong into a people who were not impressed by Roman discipline, engineering, or sheer arrogance, the Parthians. These were no tribal confederations or fragile kingdoms. Parthia was a cavalry masterpiece. Horse archers who could fire arrows in every direction, even backward while retreating at full speed, a tactic so terrifying to Roman infantry that it became legendary as the Parthian shot. Rome learned the hard way when Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's richest men and a key figure of the First Triumvirate, marched into Mesopotamia seeking glory. Instead, at Carrhae in 53 BC, his legions were surrounded by Parthian cavalry, shredded with arrows, and humiliated. Crassus himself died in disgrace, and Persian legend says molten gold was poured into his mouth as mockery for his greed. Rome, used to crushing everyone, suddenly found something new, a power it couldn't bully, a power that fought differently, thought differently, and refused to fit into Rome's understanding of the world. The East had met the West, and neither planned to yield. From that moment, the frontier between Rome and Persia, stretching across Armenia, northern Mesopotamia, and the Syrian plains, became the most volatile fault line on Earth. Entire kingdoms existed solely to be fought over. Armenia, especially, lived its life as a buffer, switching allegiance between Rome and Persia, depending on who threatened, bribed, or invaded it last. To live there was to accept that your king might kneel to Rome on Monday and to Persia on Friday, and no one blamed him. Survival demanded flexibility. Both empires understood something dangerous. Whoever controlled these buffer states controlled the gateway to the other empire. So every few decades, a new Roman emperor or a new Persian shah would vow to settle the frontier once and for all, and armies would thunder across ancient plains, convinced they were finally ending a conflict older than their own dynasties. But every time, the war endured. Because the struggle between Rome and Persia was not mere geopolitics. It was a duel of civilizations. Rome represented order, law, massive legions, and the belief that the world needed Roman governance to be civilized. Persia, first Parthian, then Sassanian, represented divine kingship, elite cavalry, aristocratic families, and a worldview stretching back to the days of Cyrus the Great. Each empire believed it carried a universal mission. Rome believed its laws should rule all. Persia believed it was the true heir of the ancient world and the guardian of cosmic order. Neither could destroy the other, and neither could tolerate the other's definition of power. And so the war settled into a rhythm: invasions, counter-invasions, assassinations, stolen kings, betrayed treaties, and fragile truces that everyone understood would break eventually. This wasn't a conflict measured in battles, it was measured in centuries. Everything changed in the 3rd century AD when the Sassanian dynasty overthrew the Parthians and revived Persian centralization with a vengeance. The Sassanians saw themselves as restorers of ancient Persian glory, heirs of Darius and Xerxes. They did not see Rome as a rival. They saw Rome as a foreign occupier sitting on lands that Persia believed belonged to them. The fire between the empires grew hotter. Shapur I, one of Persia's greatest kings, smashed Roman armies and achieved something no one had ever done. He captured a Roman emperor alive. Valerian was taken prisoner and, according to Persian relief carvings, forced to kneel before Shapur like a trophy. In Rome, the humiliation was so great that they regretted engraving any image of Valerian thereafter. But Rome struck back. Diocletian and Galerius reorganized the empire, rebuilt the legions, and invaded Persia with renewed ferocity. They even sacked Ctesiphon, Persia's capital, proving once again that neither empire could ever truly dominate the other. Whatever one destroyed, the other rebuilt. Whatever one seized, the other reclaimed. The war was a pendulum that never stopped swinging. Then religion entered the battlefield. Christianity, now spreading through the Roman Empire, eventually became the state religion under Theodosius in the late 4th century. Persia, meanwhile, promoted Zoroastrianism as a cultural pillar. Suddenly, border tensions gained theological weight. Christians living in Persia were suspected of Roman sympathy and were sometimes persecuted. Zoroastrians living inside Roman territory were eyed with suspicion as potential Persian agents. Religious identity became entangled with political loyalty. When Roman emperors and Persian shahs exchanged letters, they increasingly referenced divine favor, as though each believed their god had personally ordained their empire's survival. And yet, despite this tension, Rome and Persia constantly traded goods, gold, ideas, doctors, architects, and even spies. They despised each other, but they needed the rivalry. It kept them innovative and alert. By the 5th and 6th centuries, the war had become a hereditary burden passed from emperor to emperor. Anastasius, Justin I, Justinian, Khosrow I, and countless others inherited a conflict older than their own royal bloodlines. Justinian sent his brilliant general Belisarius against Persia one decade, then against the Goths the next. Persian kings funded Roman rebels. Roman emperors supported Persian coups. Each empire meddled in the other's internal politics so effectively that sometimes it felt like a single dysfunctional family spanning the entire Near East. They hated each other, yet they understood each other better than they understood anyone else. Then came the final catastrophe, the last Roman-Persian War, starting in 602. It began with the murder of Emperor Maurice of Byzantium. His overthrow by Phocas enraged Khosrow II of Persia, who claimed Maurice was his ally. Persia invaded supposedly to avenge him, but really because they sensed weakness. What followed was apocalyptic. Persian armies swept across the Near East with unprecedented success. Jerusalem fell, Egypt fell, Syria fell. The Persians reached the walls of Constantinople itself. For a moment, it looked as though Persia had finally broken the ancient stalemate and would destroy Rome forever. But Rome, now the Byzantine Empire, did something astonishing. Under Emperor Heraclius, they launched a desperate counteroffensive. Heraclius gambled everything, marching deep into Persia rather than defending his own land. He burned Persian temples, shattered armies, and forced Persia into chaos. The war became a whirlwind of betrayals, assassinations, palace coups, and stunning reversals. By 628, Persia was imploding. Khosrow II was overthrown by his own son. The Persians sued for peace. And at last, after 7 centuries of war, the frontier fell silent. There was no victory, only exhaustion. Both empires were gutted, millions dead, cities ruined, treasuries empty. their armies shadows of what they once were. And that was when a new power arrived, the armies of Islam, united under the Rashidun Caliphate. When Arab forces surged out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s, they found two ancient empires so depleted that neither could resist. Persia collapsed entirely within a generation, ending over 1,000 years of Iranian imperial tradition. Rome survived, but barely, losing Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and much of Anatolia. The ancient duel between Rome and Persia didn't end because one defeated the other. It ended because their 700-year struggle drained them so deeply that a force neither had prepared for swept them aside. And yet, the legacy of this colossal war echoes through history. The borders of modern Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq are built on the skeleton of the Roman-Persian frontier. Christian and Zoroastrian communities still remember persecutions tied to this rivalry. The Byzantine Islamic Wars, the Crusades, the Ottoman-Safavid conflicts, all are downstream effects of the ancient East-West divide forged between Rome and Persia. Even today, geopolitical tensions between Western and Eastern powers carry shadows of this ancient duality. It is no exaggeration to say the entire concept of an East-West cultural divide originates from the Rome-Persia War. What makes this conflict so fascinating is that despite centuries of hatred, Rome and Persia shaped each other more than any other civilizations. Roman military reforms were often reactions to Persian innovations. Persian armor and cavalry tactics evolved to counter Roman legions. Court rituals, imperial iconography, diplomatic traditions all influenced each other. They would never admit it, but Rome needed Persia, and Persia needed Rome. Their rivalry made them stronger. Their hatred kept them sharp. Without Persia, Rome might have imploded from overexpansion centuries earlier. Without Rome, Persia might have stagnated under aristocratic complacency. They were enemies, but perfect enemies, each preventing the other from becoming something worse. And that is why the story matters, because it shows how civilizations define themselves through conflict, how a rivalry can outlive every army, every king, every generation, how two powerful cultures can clash for centuries and still influence each other in ways their people never realized, and how, in the end, the greatest danger to a superpower is not defeat by a rival, but exhaustion from fighting that rival for too long. Rome and Persia fought until neither could continue, and the world changed forever. Their war shaped 7 centuries of human history, yet most people today barely know it happened. But its echoes surround us, in borders, in religions, in geopolitics, in the very idea of East and West. A 700-year war, mostly forgotten, but never truly gone. But perhaps the most astonishing part of this saga is what happened after the war finally ended, because the fall of Persia and the survival of Byzantium did not erase the impact of the rivalry. Instead, it created a new world where the memory of that struggle continued to shape identities, politics, and even mythologies for more than 1,000 years. When the Islamic caliphates absorbed former Persian territories, they inherited not just land, but an imperial tradition sharpened by centuries of conflict with Rome. Persian administrators, engineers, and scholars soon became foundational pillars of the Islamic Golden Age, blending their ancient heritage with the new religious order. And while the Sassanian dynasty vanished, the Persian sense of cultural uniqueness survived and evolved, partly because it had been defined for centuries against Rome. Even conquered, Persia refused to dissolve. Meanwhile, the Byzantines, who believed they were the rightful continuation of Rome, retreated into a tighter, more defensive empire. Their identity hardened. They saw themselves less as conquerors of the world and more as guardians of a sacred tradition besieged by enemies on all sides. That mindset, strangely enough, was forged not by the Arabs who conquered their lands, but by the Persians who had pushed them to the brink long before Islam arrived. Byzantine military manuals, written during the Arab wars of the 7th and 8th centuries, constantly referenced Persian strategies, Persian cavalry, Persian diplomacy. Even gone, Persia remained Byzantium's mental template for understanding threats. And the echoes go deeper still. Many of the most dramatic stories that would later shape the medieval world, the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, the bitter rivalries between Sunni and Shia, the expansion of Turkic powers into Iran, the eventual clash between the Crusader states and the Seljuk Empire, were all influenced by the political vacuum left behind when the Roman-Persian struggle ended. It's almost as if history, having grown used to two titans balancing each other, scrambled to fill the missing gravitational forces once one of them disappeared. Even the concept of the frontier changed. For centuries, the border between Rome and Persia had been a zone of fortresses, trading posts, espionage networks, and contested cities. When the Caliphate absorbed those lands, the new frontier shifted dramatically westward. The old Roman-Persian fault line, however, remained psychologically alive. Local populations, who had spent generations switching loyalties between Rome and Persia, depending on who marched through their town last, now found themselves adjusting to a new imperial culture. Some adapted easily, others rebelled. In Armenia, Georgia, and the Caucasus, regions that had been battlegrounds for centuries, local leaders continued to negotiate their survival using the same strategies they once used between Rome and Persia, only now directed toward Byzantium and the Caliphate. But what might be the most overlooked effect of the 700-year rivalry is how it influenced the storytelling traditions of both civilizations. Heroes, villains, myths of divine kingship, saints, martyrs, and legendary generals all grew in the soil of this colossal struggle. In Persia, kings like Shapur and Khosrow became semi-mythical figures in epic poetry. Their battles against Rome were retold not merely as military events, but as cosmic confrontations between order and chaos. In the Roman world, soldiers and saints who resisted Persian invasions were celebrated in Byzantine chronicles. The war became a moral landscape, a story that explained who they were and why their civilization mattered. The fact that many of these stories survived long after the political realities faded shows just how deeply the rivalry had embedded itself in cultural identity. And even today, the ancient duality has a strange way of reappearing. Modern political analysts, historians, and philosophers often note that the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern worlds still reflect a kind of East-West tension that feels eerily familiar to the rivalry between Rome and Persia. We talk about cultural blocks, spheres of influence, ideological differences, concepts that are not new but echoes of the ancient competition between two empires that refused to coexist peacefully. The modern map doesn't show Roman or Persian provinces, but the fault lines they fought over, Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia, Anatolia, Iran, remain some of the most contested regions on Earth. What makes the story even more compelling is how fragile both empires truly were beneath their grand armies and monumental architecture. For all their power, both Rome and Persia were constantly balancing on the edge of internal collapse. Rebellions, economic strain, religious disputes, ambitious aristocrats, military factions that acted like states within states. The fact that they managed to wage war for 7 centuries while still maintaining the appearance of stability is one of the greatest illusions in world history. Every emperor and shah inherited not only a throne, but a centuries-old burden of unfinished conflict. Some embraced it. Some tried to escape it. None succeeded. And this brings us to an even deeper truth. The 700-year struggle was never just about land or glory. It was about legitimacy. Rome, with its universalist ideology, believed that it alone represented civilization. Persia, with its ancient royal lineage, believed that it alone represented divine kingship ordained by cosmic forces. Both empires believed the world was only truly right when they were strong. This sense of destiny meant they could never stop fighting. because stopping would mean admitting that the other possessed the right to exist on equal terms. In the end, neither empire won. But paradoxically, both succeeded in shaping the world so profoundly that their influence still lingers across continents and cultures. When you read about religious schisms, shifting borders, imperial ambitions, philosophical debates about East and West, or the endless tug-of-war in the Middle East, you are witnessing the aftershocks of a conflict that technically ended in the 7th century, but has never truly disappeared from the human imagination. The Roman-Persian War may be ancient, but its fingerprints are everywhere. In the architecture of Istanbul, in the ruins of Ctesiphon, in Persian literature and Byzantine mosaics, in the cultural memory of entire nations, and in the unspoken idea that somewhere in the world, two great powers are always staring at each other across a frontier, convinced that history is on their side. That is the true legacy of the 700-year war. Not the battles, not the treaties, not the emperors or kings, but the enduring idea that civilizations define themselves not only by what they build, but by what they resist. Rome and Persia resisted each other for 7 centuries, and in doing so, they shaped the world we live in more than any peace ever could.